afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this webinar hosted by ourselves, CryptoUK, and in partnership with our members, Andersen. We're delighted today to bring this session to you to talk about demystifying CARF, and we have a fantastic lineup of panelists who will be taking us through some of the information and details that we think you will find useful on your journey to navigate the CARF implementation. We are joined by the OECD and HMRC today, and our partners Andersen, and we have Jill from Gemini. I will hand over to the panel to do some intros shortly. Just for your record, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make this recording available afterwards. If you have any questions throughout the session, can I ask that you drop them into the Q&A function? We will try and go through as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session. Any that we can't, we will obviously endeavour to come back to you individually afterwards. So please feel free to put your name and details against those if there's anything specific you would like us to respond to. Okay, we'll get started. I will hand over. We'll do some very brief intros from the panel, and then we'll work through our agenda. So I will start with yourself, Paul.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Hondius, and I am the head of the Harmful Tax Practices Unit and a senior advisor on exchange of information at the OECD. And as part of the things that I've been doing in the last couple of years, I've been working very actively on the development of the CARF, and so very happy to share that work with you today in some more detail.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Hywel?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hywel Griffith. I'm the Cryptoasset Reporting Framework Policy Lead in the Exchange of Information team in HMRC. I've been working on this now for about 3 years, I think. And before that, I was working in controlled foreign companies policy at HMRC.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hywel. Philippa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Philippa Lewis. I am also from HMRC. I work within the Financial Products and Services team. One of the areas that I cover is crypto assets, and that's where I support Hywel in the development of the Cryptoasset Reporting Framework.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everyone.
And Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Dymtrow, head of tax information reporting at Gemini. I have a long history of consulting in the area of tax information reporting for over 20 years now, and primarily on the US side, but also have a good depth of experience implementing FATCA and CRS at different financial institutions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jill. And lastly, Dion, if you'd like to do your intro, but then maybe if you'd like to just do a little bit of scene setting for us and just set the context as to why now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sue. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So I'm Dion Seymour, Andersen in the UK. We're a tax consultancy, and we cover all sorts of things tax related and crypto assets in particular. And my experience was for CARF, or the Cryptoasset Reporting Framework, and I'll just keep calling it CARF from here on, is I represented the UK as part of the negotiations for CARF on behalf of HMRC, whilst I was at the policy lead at HMRC for crypto. So as Sue said, why now? And I think this is the important point that we want to cover in this webinar. Firstly, CryptoUK stood up a working group on the CARF and the obligations that would actually follow from the introduction of CARF. This was some time ago, and CARF seemed very, very far away at that point in time. And the working group considered that some form of education via a webinar would actually be very helpful for the members to not only increase awareness of CARF, but also to better understand the obligations that will follow from this. So that's why today we will be hearing from the OECD, who will be talking about what CARF is, and much more than from HMRC, they'll be talking about the obligations that will be coming from CARF. As a side note, I mentioned the working group there. The next working group meeting will actually be on Tuesday, next Tuesday. Members can become involved by contacting either Sue or Suzanne to express their interest in attending. There is only one requirement if you do attend, and that's participation is mandatory. I do expect anyone who's part of the working group to give full participation. Of course, if you're not a member of CryptoUK and this has been recorded, then Sue and Suzanne will also be able to help you with that as well. Just to note as an aside, the upcoming reporting standard will provide tax administrations with unprecedented levels of information to crypto asset ownership. And I think it's fair to say that to date, this does not appear to have captured the industry's interest in quite the same way that regulations like the Fifth Money Laundering Directive did. I certainly know that in the lead up to the introduction of MLD5, there was a lot of, should we say, chatter in the industry, and I'm just not quite hearing that to the same extent with CARF. However, this reporting standard will actually have a wide impact on industry participants, and probably to the same level, if not more, than the Fifth Money Laundering Directive did for industry in general. And whilst implementation may seem a long way off, I think you're going to find it's going to be here much sooner than many of us actually think. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Paul to start giving a bit more of an overview from the OECD's perspective on CARF. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Dion. Yes, and I think I'm in the lucky position to kick this webinar off, and of course, very happy to do that and share with you a little bit the journey towards the CARF, and of course also what we are trying to achieve with this framework. So I think this all started in the light of two factors that came together. Firstly, of course, the development of the crypto asset sector over the last number of years in an accelerated manner, but also a first review that we did of our initial international standard on automatic exchange of tax information, the Common Reporting Standard. And I think one of the areas that came out of that space was that we should try to take an initiative to make sure that not only traditional financial markets are subject to tax reporting and exchange of information, but also the crypto market. And so that was the reason why we started this policy work at OECD level to develop what then became the Cryptoasset Reporting Framework. And that has since then been endorsed by over 50 jurisdictions that have said that they want to do this. And I think also importantly, both the OECD as well as the G20, and then very recently the Global Forum have all adopted the CARF as an international standard for tax transparency. And so I think what we are going to see very likely over the next number of years is that an increasing number of countries are going to implement domestic legislation that reflects the model rules that are in the CARF. Those initiatives are, of course, underway in the UK, but also in the EU through the DAC 8 directive. The US is similarly working on rules to translate the CARF into reporting requirements in the US and many other significant jurisdictions across the world. I think you can go to almost any corner and you'll see that there is uptake for this standard, which I think reflects the need of tax administrations to get access to this kind of information for tax compliance purposes. Now, I think on substance, what is the structure of the CARF? I think this goes a bit along the lines of who does what and when. So I think the first question is who. Of course, it is a third-party reporting regime. And through that, it is, of course, an important first step to identify relevant intermediaries. And so that's why we have this definition in the CARF, which is abbreviated to RCASP, but stands for Reporting Crypto Asset Service Provider. And I think it broadly translates to anyone that as a business either trades crypto for crypto or crypto for fiat. That's in a nutshell who we want to cover. And that, of course, covers exchanges, but it can also cover brokers and other intermediaries that act in crypto asset markets. Then, of course, I think the next question is, what is subject to reporting? And that was, of course, gave rise to lengthy discussions at OECD level. And I think the place where we landed is that we want to capture both exchange transactions and transfers of crypto assets that are facilitated by RCASPs. The reason for that being is that they, of course, both give visibility on how a person is transacting in crypto. And I think importantly, especially in the transfer place, it also hopefully addresses movements from platforms or hot wallets towards cold wallets over time, so that there is a bit of visibility as to the amount of crypto that somebody holds and the frequency in which somebody trades in crypto. The reporting then is I would say semi-aggregate, so we don't have a full transactional reporting deliberately. Of course, the idea there is to reduce data volumes and to not do unnecessary reporting. So I say semi-aggregate because it is in principle aggregated, but it is aggregated by transaction type. So whether this is an exchange or a transfer, and it is also aggregated by type of crypto assets. So for instance, all Bitcoin transactions would go into a single bucket. And similarly, if there are other crypto assets involved, they would go in separate buckets for reporting purposes. I think now that I've spoken about the type of transactions and the type of providers that are subject to the CARF, the next step probably is asking the question, what kind of players and what kind of assets are in. I think here we have adopted a broad definition deliberately on both fronts. As far as the service providers are concerned, I think the relevant notion to bear in mind is that there needs to be a sufficient amount of control over the platform or the product that facilitates the exchanges. That of course covers the centralized players. I think that's quite obvious. But there is commentary language also in the CARF that allows bringing decentralized platforms in scope if there is control over the transactions that are taking place. And of course, forms of control that one can contemplate there are either controls over the software protocols or control over the consideration that is being paid for facilitating these transactions. So we certainly hope that over time we can capture both the centralized and the decentralized world in a sufficiently consistent and comprehensive manner. Closely related to that is the question of what kind of assets are in scope. And I think in a bit of a similar notion of this control notion, also there we have relied on existing other concepts, in particular in the money laundering space. Where we have built our definition of what is a relevant crypto asset on the notion of can it be used for payment or investment purposes, which is the notion that the FATF uses to decide whether a crypto asset should be subject to AML obligations. And so there we have also sought to be closely aligned to make sure that customer documentation is available when tax reporting is required. I think in practice that means that there is no general exclusion of non-fungible tokens, but rather the test that would need to be done is to decide whether the non-fungible token has the function of being able to be held for payment or investment purposes. And I think that will be, of course, an important test that crypto asset service providers would need to do. Then maybe moving briefly, now that I already said something about the AML space, into how should customers be documented. The default process there is, I think, two steps. One is a self-certification about the identity and tax residence of each user of a crypto asset service provider. That self-certification is a form that is filled in either digitally or on paper, more likely digitally in this world, by the user, and then validated by the service provider against the existing AML documentation to make sure that the representations made about identity and tax residence are reliable. That applies to both individuals and entities that are active on these platforms as users. And in addition to that, it also applies to the beneficial owners of entities. In principle, there are certain exceptions, but in principle, entities are also required to self-certify the identity and tax residency of the beneficial owners to make sure that an entity cannot be used to shield from reporting on these transactions. So I think that's the main technical features. And now maybe very briefly, where are we in the implementation process? As I said, I think we are slowly but surely advancing. The framework was fully agreed last year, and as I said, it's now supported by 50+ jurisdictions, and hopefully that will further increase. I think 3 core steps that are currently underway. Firstly, countries advancing with domestic legislation to translate the CARF, including the UK, of course. Then I think secondly, we hopefully will have later in the year signings of the international agreement to establish the automatic exchange relationships between countries implementing the CARF. And I think thirdly, and maybe importantly, we are also working on making sure that we have the conditions in place to have an efficient operational framework that I think again consists in two main work streams. Firstly, an XML schema that will ensure that there is a standardized electronic reporting format for this information, and that we hope to release in the next couple of months by summer. I think is certainly to be expected. And then in parallel to that, we are also increasingly taking up work on issuing further guidance and frequently asked questions on questions surrounding the implementation of the CARF. Of course, the CARF rules are relatively compact and general in nature. And of course, as implementation is progressing, more and more questions come to the surface. And I can certainly only encourage those of you that are active in the crypto sector and are working on implementation or will be working on implementation to raise any issues that you may come across either through our business group at OECD level, or also, of course, directly with HMRC, so that they can feed into this process. So I think that's in a nutshell where this work stands. I know that was a lot of information for 10 minutes, but I wanted to share as much as I could about what is happening on this front and pass the message that slowly but surely this is becoming a reality across the globe. So thank you, and I give back to Sue.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was really, really useful. And again, just a reminder, if people could put any questions into the Q&A section, that would be really helpful, just so that we have access to those. We're going to hand over to HMRC now. So to Hywel, if you just bear with me one moment, I will just get the slides up, and Hywel, if you just let me know when they're on screen.
Okay, I can see them. Can everyone else see them?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay, so my name is Hywel Griffith. Nice to see you again. I'll be talking about the UK's CARF consultation. This was our policy consultation that was first issued at Spring Budget. So that was on the 6th of March. And that is open and running until the 29th of May. This is a policy consultation that we're looking at. So for a bit of context, in the UK environment, we have policy consultations that look more broadly at the kind of the general principles about what we're trying to implement, and also technical consultations that zoom in on the actual draft regulations that, as Paul said, we will use to implement the CARF in the UK. So for now, we're looking at the policy elements. And one key aspect, I guess, of this policy consultation is that we are consulting on a finalized CARF, a finalized OECD framework. And so unlike perhaps some other policy consultations in the UK where there might be more scope to vary things, here we're more about looking at how we're going to implement, looking at the technicalities of implementing in the UK, whether that's timelines or penalty regimes or specifics relevant to the UK. So that's perhaps something helpful to keep in mind as we run through the sections and the questions. So next slide, please. So the CARF consultation actually sits in a broader consultation. It's the CARF and CRS consultation that we put out there. And that's set into 4 broad sections. We have our CARF first, we have the updates to the CRS, the Common Reporting Standard, which interacts with the CARF and extends the existing offshore sort of banking and financial accounts transparency regime to include new fintech and innovations, and we'll see how that kind of interacts in a moment. And then finally, we have the question of whether we would extend these reporting frameworks to the UK for domestic reporting, as we call it. And Philippa, my colleague, will speak on that at the end of this presentation. So first up, this is section 1 here, and we've structured it around the overall sections of the CARF, and the consultation document itself is zoning in on those definitions particularly, or the actual wording that we have in the Cryptoasset Reporting Framework. And the big emphasis here, particularly in these first three sections, the definitions, the reporting requirements, and the due diligence, the big focus is on guidance and clarity. And so how we can look at making things consistent, but also clear as you kind of give feedback on examples. Then when we look at compliance and enforcement, we're looking more about how we make sure we've got a robust regime. And finally, on impacts, we're looking at what this will mean for you. And I think it'll be really helpful that we have this session from Gemini coming up and getting more of a sense of what this will mean in practice. Next slide. And so then we've got our three remaining questions there, which are much more a kind of call for evidence. And so that'll be much more a case of a potential, whether this would work for stakeholders and HMRC, and really looking for some first thoughts there. So next slide. Now, a bit of context, I will say I've realized that Paul and the OECD has done a marvelous job of running through a lot of the technical details. So I think we'll be able to speed through some of my elements of that. All I can add perhaps is this visual flow chart, which came about. The first response to our policy consultation was submitted, I think in a week after it being out. And one of the requests there was for flowcharts. So being the agile, responsive government agency that we are, I got in PowerPoint and drawing up some flowcharts. So looking at this is basically visualizing what Paul was describing earlier. For both the crypto asset definition and the crypto asset report service provider definition, I think the thing to emphasize is that we might start broad, but then it is narrowed down and honed to ensure it's sort of proportionate, and to be sure that we're looking at things that actually are relevant to a tax risk. And so in this kind of this approach, we start with that broader functional definition. We first can look to central bank digital currencies or specified electronic money payments, which can be which will be covered under this CRS 2. And so if you are perhaps if you're in that area where you a traditional financial institution, or if you're in an area where you're perhaps a new player and you're looking at these kind of things, it will make sense to look at the whole consultation and not just the CARF part. And then finally, if you remain in scope there, the final question is about whether the asset can be used for payment or investment purposes. And again, as Paul said, the big point here is that we're trying to refer back to the FATF principles and align with the FATF definitions of virtual assets. Next slide, please. Again, we have a sort of similar kind of flow with the definition of crypto asset service providers. So that's who will actually be reporting, in our case, in the UK. One thing to point out is that we have this, we start the definition with entities and individuals. So in the common reporting standard, that's more focused on entities, but in the CARF, we also look to individuals too. It will be only if those entities or individuals are providing services as a business. And so in that case, what the CARF will refer to is our kind of domestic way of establishing that. So thinking about how we define whether something is a trade or not in the UK. Again, on behalf of customers, adds a little nuance, which I won't get into just in terms of time here. And then finally, the big area really where I think we'll want lots of feedback, lots of input from industry, is this point about effectuating exchange transactions. And so what we're looking at there is if the entity or individual as a business on behalf of customers is effectuating exchange transactions, so making them happen, then you start to fall into that definition of reporting, relevant crypto asset service provider. So next slide, please. And so the CARF itself does provide guidance and examples in the commentary. So again, we'll be building from those fixed pieces of guidance or fixed steers that are in the commentary itself. But where we can add perhaps local color to that or local kind of flavors to that, then we'll do that. So again, we're looking at market makers, dealers, and brokers, as Paul said, and that final point is that question about decentralization and making available a trading platform. And again, in that case, as Paul said, we'd be referring across to FATF guidance and principles on control and sufficient influence, and to make sure that there is actually this only applies in cases where there's actually someone with the capacity to control or influence the platform. Next slide, please. And so another area that, again, examples and perhaps feedback on real structures in the market that would be important is on the nexus hierarchy. Figuring out where a CASP might need to report is based on these nexuses, which each represent a connecting factor, perhaps, to a jurisdiction. So we're looking at a hierarchy where the higher up your nexus is, the stronger your connecting factor is. And so at the top there, that's what would take precedence if you have multiple connections to different jurisdictions. If you were tax resident in a CARF jurisdiction, but you also had a place of business further down, you will report in the tax residence jurisdiction. And if those higher nexuses are non-CARF jurisdictions, then you'd have the reporting requirement come lower down on that nexus list. Next slide, please. And so again, we're looking at definitions. And so we're looking at ways in which in the consultation, we can get more examples or particular feedback on how this will work for industry. So the due diligence procedures involve identifying all of your sort of crypto users, entities or individuals, and then figuring out which are in an actual CARF jurisdiction and so are relevant. In terms of timing, we have a question here about making the reporting deadline the equivalent for the Common Reporting Standard. And so that would be 31st of May. And so what we would be looking at in terms of implementation then is for data collection from the 1st of January 2026 and reporting by the 31st of May 2027. And so that brings us back to this point about why now. Now is the time where if we give ourselves, say, a kind of best practice 18-month lead in to get ready for this, then that will be coming up this summer. Next slide, please. Another element that is not is specific to domestic implementation is making sure that the CARF is implemented properly in the UK. So it's not just a case of the tax authority looking to see that industry are complying with this. We are also, Paul and the OECD and the Global Forum will be looking, and we are peer reviewed on whether we as a jurisdiction are properly implementing the CARF. And so part of that means that we need to have effective compliance and enforcement rules in place. And so again, this is about engaging with industry in the consultation to get a sense of what will be a proportionate and accurate system. And our approach here is to try to align with the mandatory rules for digital platforms, which is another third-party reporting framework. Next slide, please. Another element in a HMRC consultation, in a UK government policy consultation, is that we try to put out our initial estimates of what this will cost for government to implement and for business to implement. That's split between one-off costs and ongoing costs in our current sort of estimates. But we're very much looking to have a dialogue and to get as much evidence from business here to refine these estimates and improve them as we go. And for, well, I'll now hand over to Philippa to discuss the domestic reporting.
Thanks very much, Hywel. So yeah, as we know, the OECD, CARF and the CRS don't actually require reporting entities to provide data on UK resident taxpayers as it stands. So what the last sort of few questions on our consultation, we ask around the impacts and sort of the real world impacts and the timeline impacts for potentially including that obligation in any implementation of the CRS amendments and the CARF. If we take a step back initially, have a little bit of a picture as to how things look currently. We have our domestic information powers as they stand for CRS, which I won't go into this call because it's CARF specific. We have the BBSI returns, the Bank and Building Society interest returns. But for crypto assets, we tend to use Schedule 23 of the Finance Act 2011 for bulk data requests, and then for individual taxpayers, we tend to use Schedule 36 of the Finance Act 2008. So why have we asked this question in the first place? Well, with Schedule 23, the ad hoc requests, which means you don't know you need to gather the data until we ask for it. That can cause complexity, and it can also cause inconsistency. So looking at the Office for Tax Simplification report on third-party data, which does recommend alignment with third-party schemas, including those from the OECD. And after asking the question in the Tax Administration Framework Review for information and data, we got the feedback and the positive impression from the industry that alignment with existing schemas for third-party data is a good way to go. It's something that we should be considering when we implement OECD schemas or for third-party data schemas. And this has led us to ask the question very openly, what would the impact be if we were to do this? Is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? And it's a genuine question. We're asking for your thoughts on that. I'm going to wrap it up there from HMRC. I think we've kind of run out of time, unfortunately. But this is the start of a discussion. It's not the end of the discussion. Some of you may be aware that HMRC have regular crypto asset roundtables. You're more than welcome to join them. They are hosted by Liang Tang, who is the crypto asset policy lead for tax in HMRC. And please feel free to get in touch.
Thank you, Philippa,
very much.
Thank you as well. That was really, really comprehensive overview there. And I think we touched upon this through those sessions. Obviously, there are some operational impacts on organisations that are obviously operating within the crypto asset space. And we're delighted today to be joined by Jill Dymtrow from Gemini. And Jill's going to spend some time just talking through some of the issues that they think they'll be facing and obviously how they're preparing themselves in readiness for CARF as well. So Jill, over to you.
Thank you so much, Philippa. And Sue, I think that the slide that Hywel showed about compliance and enforcement is a really good roadmap to understand that you need to build procedures to avoid every single one of those items. So making sure your documentation is in order, overall understanding where you're obligated to report and who you're obligated to report in different jurisdictions. The devil is always in the details. Overall, it doesn't seem that complicated. Report the identity of your clients and report their somewhat summarized transactions. But it does get a lot more complicated in implementation. So just for instance, the documentation portion, collecting these self-certifications, the rules are very specific about collecting upon the inception of the relationship, which is somewhat helpful because that's generally when you're collecting all of the KYC documentation. And there is a marriage between tax documentation and KYC documentation and a requirement to compare those to ensure that the self-certification is in fact valid. Just collecting a self-certification with all the required data elements does not get you where you need to be. You do have to make sure that the information provided is aligned with the other documentation you've collected. So take a moment to consider the documentation that you are collecting under FATF-AML requirements. How much of that is digitized, and what do you have in terms of do you have a PDF that when you get the self-certification, presumably digitally, are you going to have to compare? And what tools have you given yourself in order to do that? So if you do have the information on your KYC document digitized, it can be an automated back end check to ensure that you do have consistency. And where you don't have consistency there, you need to create triggers to identify those to follow up with. This also isn't an inexpensive endeavor. So you might have an account opened and go through all the AML, KYC, and tax certification comparison process, and then the trade. So it is difficult to make sure that you're doing this in the most effective and efficient manner, but you're doing it correctly so you won't run into conflicts down the line. Another complication that I see that we're facing is a lot of, in CRS implementations, a lot of times you had a financial institution that already had some sort of tax reporting infrastructure in terms of staffing a tax ops group, or software that would kind of contribute to, ensuring compliance with these types of things. For a lot of CASPs, we're tech companies essentially. So making sure that, a lot of people don't have these kind of tax ops groups within their organization. A lot of these processes are run digitally, which can be somewhat helpful in terms of, making sure you're building or buying the right technology. But essentially, putting this process into place to capture the correct transactions. On crypto to fiat, you've got, perhaps you have a buy or a sell, great. Crypto to crypto, that's a single transaction that could be two reportable, right? A buy of one asset and a sell of another, and making sure that you're capturing that with a consistent price for both ends of that transaction. There's a certain amount of work that's going to have to go behind that process to make sure it's being done correctly and consistently. Reporting transfers even, so identifying consistently wallets that might be going to a different exchange, or wallets that might be a customer's cold storage. I think that initially might be difficult, and as things evolve, you'll see kind of better resources for identifying which wallets are which. But that is something that I think we're, CASPs will struggle with initially. Other steps that I think are going to be difficult is, just ensuring that we launch CRS efforts, registering with each portal, making sure we had XMLs formatted for different portals for CASPs that operate in multiple jurisdictions is always a struggle. Hopefully, since we've had those portals stood up for CRS for years now, we can kind of piggyback the CARF effort to those, and they'll be kind of in more of a developed state with better documentation. So we'll know exactly what to report to each jurisdiction. And again, with documentation, you might have conflicting information for some of your clients, and making sure you're getting to the bottom of that. And then that you have processes and procedures in place to clearly align each of your customers with reporting where you need to report them. There are kind of a lot of steps that need to be taken to get to the finish line here in terms of, when we're actually going to be required to submit. So I'm always in favor of phased in requirements. I know that the OECD framework does give timelines for papering pre-existing accounts. I think those are really helpful. Starting a new process to document is, a big effort to stand up, and you'll learn a lot of lessons from that process in order to kind of repaper existing accounts over certain levels. And then different requirements in terms of, perhaps high value accounts would be reported or documented first, and just giving people time to get used to the reporting schemas, formatting their data in that way. I think I'm always an advocate of that. We are tech companies, so I think it's nice that we're kind of more nimble and agile than a lot of kind of traditional financial institutions, but it can also be challenging thinking that, we'll just put that in the next sprint and get it done, where there's absolutely things you're going to run into if you're kind of starting slow with testing. submitting certain data points, and then kind of over a several year period, phasing in a full implementation where the jurisdiction will know what to do with the data it's receiving, and the RCASPs will understand, how to get to where they need to get to without trying to kind of jump in fully on day one. So those are some of the challenges that we're looking at, and hoping that get enough time in order to implement properly and put all the steps in place we need to get each jurisdiction what they need. Sue, I'll turn it back over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jill. It sounds like you've got a busy time ahead of you, but hopefully the information is going to be made available and you'll be able to implement in sufficient time. Dion, just in terms of the final sessions before we move into Q&A, it'd be really helpful to get your view and the view from Andersen, just in terms of some guidance really and support on what firms need to be doing to be operationally ready, and just some next steps that they should be considering.
Absolutely. So thank you, Sue. And I'm going to make this quick because we've got some great questions that have come in that we want to spend some time for. So apologies, I am going to speak quickly. So I'm just going to quickly recap on some of the comments that have actually been made to highlight the array of challenges that are actually going to exist for businesses on the implementation of the CARF framework. As we've heard from Paul, the framework will cover a number of different international jurisdictions. Clearly, this is a significant global reporting obligation that's been introduced with a number of different jurisdictions being added. Over 50 was a frame that he said. Hywel has highlighted that consultation is currently open for responses on the implementation and the questions that HMRC have on CARF, and obviously Philippa mentioning about how the information will be used from a domestic as well as international reporting framework, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. Jill has highlighted that there are questions such as perhaps a build and buy approach, because there are tech firms and they like to do their sprints from RCAS to, and also for RCAS to gather the necessary information to identify individuals, to identify the transactions and all the other information to get them to the finish line, as she put it so well. So the impact of CARF will clearly be very wide-ranging, and whilst the obligations under regulations such as MLD5 will actually help to some extent, the industry needs to be much more ready for CARF than we actually expected. So getting guidance, getting information, getting structures in place now is incredibly critical. For example, the international scope of CARF can actually, though, present some interesting challenges that don't exist for some of the existing regulations, such as where tax administration should be reported could actually depend on how the business is structured and relates to the nexus rules that Hywel actually commented on earlier. So where do you exist for those reporting obligations? You could exist in different jurisdictions, in which case you need to take note of that. There's questions on the scope of RCAPs, which will be discussed perhaps for some time to come, which don't exist just for CARF, but for FATF as well, such as where does decentralization fit here? And we've seen that on the radar for regulators for some time. So we're going to see some of those existing questions coming around to where do you exist? And as the OECD, as Hywel highlighted, the OECD is taking the very similar framework such as management and control being some of the deciding factors here. So again, you're going to need some advice on that. There are other questions such as how will different jurisdictions implement their domestic version of CARF? So CARF will come out, but other jurisdictions can actually add more to their domestic implementation than perhaps HMRC has already suggested from their consultation document. And it'd be great if the agreed version being used from CARF, the standard, should we call it the basic, the starting out the blocks version, is the version at the very least for a few years. This is a passionate plea to the OECD and others, so that there can be some degree of homogenization in the market. So different jurisdictions aren't being tackled with different implementation challenges. We've seen with the travel rule that actually when industry can come together to solve the problems, it can be done in quite a very good and succinct manner. And so if we can actually have that, that would be fantastic. So we would help industry work together to solve this problem. And ensuring compliance to CARF is also going to be important to ensure that you don't get penalties from the firm. And so checking returns here, particularly in the early stages, is going to be very important. Second eyes, if you will, second set of eyes that are going over what you think should be in and what you think shouldn't be in from an exchange's position would be fantastic, I think. But we also have to remember here that the impact of CARF won't just be on exchanges such as Jill mentioned from Gemini. There's going to be wider considerations, such as the information that the RCAFs will be providing to HMRC and other tax administrations, like with the Common Reporting Standard that came before, will provide more information than has been provided at any time before. So we've seen from Philippa, the current approach to information reporting is probably going to be much bigger here with CARF than we have seen before. And if you're a crypto asset investor, now is also a good time, if you're listening to this, to make sure that your affairs are up to date as well. There still remains a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions when it comes to the taxation of crypto assets. And it's always better to be in a position to approach HMRC than wait for the brown envelope or emails from the last nudge campaign to drop on your doormat. And so at that point here, Sue, I've gone through a whistle stop of what I was going to say, so we can get on to the questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dion. That definitely was whistle stop, but as you say, there's an opportunity for any of our members to get involved more with the working group and obviously to find out some more information that we can share with them as well. So thank you to everybody who has already posted some questions into the Q&A and into the chat. I'd like to invite all of the panelists back in now, and we will go through some of these questions. The first one, I think, probably is for yourself, Paul, and we've been asked, firstly, are NFTs in scope, but also will there be more guidance on when NFTs are held for payment or investment purposes, like a decision tree or minimum requirements associated to the NFT, if you're okay to take that one?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and I think that's indeed a very valid and important question that also is on our minds and on our radar. I think indeed the baseline test is the one that is in the CARF, which is, can the crypto asset be held for payment or investment purposes? And so in that sense, I think our definition is neutral towards whether the token is fungible or non-fungible. I think that will remain the test. But that being said, there is of course still a lot of room and I think also a lot of necessity for trying to come up with further guidance in this area. And ideally, of course, I think everybody would salute bright line tests, or at least safe harbors or something along those lines, where clarity can be brought. And I think there is also a big appetite within our working party to work on that and try to define further guidelines in that regard. So that's certainly an area that we are working on and that we want to work on. And also, again, as I already said in my presentation, it's very much appreciated also if from the business community there are suggestions brought to us in terms of how that guidance could or should look.
You're on mute, Sue.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Paul. I think there's another one that's probably more appropriate for yourself as well. So again, it's just combining a couple of questions here, but somebody has asked whether or not they heard correctly that the XML schema for CARF is expected by this summer. And in addition, just following on from that, somebody's asked for clarity whether or not the XML schema is XBRL in particular.
So I think the short answer to that is yes. I think, I mean, subject to the internal approval processes that we have at committee level here at the OECD, I think we are hoping to release the schema in the next 6 to 8 weeks. I think that's the timeline that we're working on. And we have also worked very closely on this schema project with the European Commission and EU member states to make sure that this schema can be used also for all purposes under DAC 8. So we hope that this can be a single schema for all countries adopting the CARF, including EU member states.
Excellent, thank you, Paul. Just moving over, probably more so now towards the team at HMRC, so to Hywel and to Philippa. One of the questions we've been asked is whether or not the domestic reporting will apply to both traditional finance and RCASPs.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take this one. So the CARF and the CRS have different criteria for who is a reportable institution or business underneath either of those regimes. Our question really relates to where there wasn't a previous obligation on those reporting institutions or businesses to give details around the UK tax residents, we're asking whether we should be doing that. And I think it's helpful here to sort of point out that it would be up to businesses or institutions to have a look at the different criteria and see whether they're in scope of either regime. But this would not directly replace our domestic information reporting powers as they stand. They would still be there, but obviously with the standardized information coming in, you can clearly see that there could be scope for limited use of it. And thanks.
Just to follow on from that as well, I mean, it's kind of been paraphrased slightly differently, but do you think that the domestic reporting proposal is actually going to streamline reporting, or is it likely to add to it?
So the aim is to provide consistency and streamline it to the OECD structured data approach. So we have this structured data schema coming in. It makes sense to make our own domestic requirements more streamlined and more in line with the practices and data gathering practices that we're asking businesses to already undertake once we implement the CARF. And so we see it as a streamlining measure, and we see it as a simplicity measure to ensure that we get good quality data that we can then use for our purposes. Thanks.
Thanks, Philippa. Keeping with HMRC, you guys are in popular demand today. One of the questions that's come through is asking how HMRC envisages that they will verify the accuracy of the data received. Just to follow on from that, in some cases, individuals are carrying out over 1 million transactions. Are efforts being made to build technical solutions in-house, or is there likely to be a tendering process from the private sector?
So I can see as well that Max maybe followed up on that and connected it back to Jill's point, which is really helpful. I was just making sure that I'm getting the question right there, Max, is that there's perhaps two elements to it, which is that, of course, the responsibility is for the RCASP to try to ensure that you're collecting accurate and aggregating accurate data and submitting accurate data. But as Jill said, and as Max echoed, when we have these kind of new frameworks and when these are complex perhaps bits of data, part of that final slide that looks at the penalties and compliance system moving to a digital platforms angle is to bring in that behavioral element to penalties, which perhaps wasn't there in the existing CRS. So we're looking there to really take account of size, to take account of effort and disclosure and that kind of thing, so that in those early years, in those early kind of periods, we're able to be accommodating and sensible really with how that's enforced. Because as you say, as when I was reading the question, I was wondering, there's potentially two sides to that, which is, how will we be processing the data and how will CAS be doing it? It's a big project for us as well, and so we're sympathetic in that sense, of course, that these are big projects, and that 18-month lead in, it's as much for us to get all of our ducks in a row as well. But in terms of the actual process of verification, I don't think we would be speaking too much yet in terms of our systems of how we'll be doing it, but in terms of whether our CASPs are going to build something in-house or look to service providers, we wouldn't dictate that at all. That would be up to industry to decide what their preference is. And again, would be really good to get evidence from you about what you think what you might be doing. And again, it might feel too early, but if we start to get that sense on how you'll be approaching your side of the verification, then we can start to build that into our impact assessments, and that means hopefully then we're being transparent and accountable as government in looking at the cost to business and the proportionality.
Fantastic, thanks, Hywel. Is there anything that anybody on the panel wanted to add just in response to any of those questions just before we wrap this up? Great. Okay, in which case I would like to say a huge thank you for all of our panelists for taking the time today. I know you're all incredibly busy, but it's hugely appreciative that you have gone through all of the information that you've shared with the attendees on this webinar and all of the information, obviously, for our members. I will follow up after this with everybody that's registered for the event, and we will share a recording of this afterwards, and also some details on how you can join the CARF working group that Dion has referred to. And if you're not a member of CryptoUK, information on how you can get in touch with us to investigate membership even further. But thank you to Dion, Paul, Philippa, Hywel, Jill. It's been a fantastic session. I hope everybody's found it useful, and I hope you all have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
you.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
afternoon.